The election of 1860 was, of course, a pivotal election in American history. It was in many ways also a fairly conventional one, offering a clear range of choices with an unambiguous outcome, thanks to the way that our presidential elections are structured. It was an election where process mattered a great deal, but where ultimately things went a lot more smoothly in those terms than is typically assumed. Now, this is, of course, an odd way to describe the election of 1860, but I think there are aspects of this that are really underappreciated in terms of how our electoral system works. My name is Michael Faber. I'm an associate professor of political science at Texas State University. I'm here today to discuss the election of 1860, which of course is one of the best known in American history and one of the few that is regularly covered in any particular depth in history textbooks. What I want to focus on today is not the basics of the election so much as rules and process, because I think that the ways in which 1860 really illuminates how our electoral system works are fundamentally procedural. And so these are some of the less known and less appreciated aspects of this election. So first, a little bit of background on the situation. Most people know reasonably well what things looked like in the 1850s. At least most people have a basic grasp of the general contours of American history. We're coming off the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, the latest semi-successful effort to try to put off the issue of slavery, try to work out a compromise between North and South. We see the Dred Scott decision in 1857, in which the Supreme Court decides to weigh in with Chief Justice Taney in the majority opinion, essentially suggesting that neither slaves nor, in fact, free blacks could in fact be citizens of the United States under the Constitution. This decision, of course, resulted in a great deal of outrage across the political spectrum for one reason or another. We see, of course, in the 1850s, the rise of abolitionism. It had already been on the rise for some time, but by this point, it is, if not really that near to a majority of people, there's still are an awful lot of fairly strong abolitionists, fairly vocal abolitionists, representing a substantial minority of the population. And in fact, given that slavery is the primary issue occurring at the time, um, it makes some sense to think about the American electorate in terms of slavery. On the one hand, on one extreme, we have radical abolitionists, those who would like very much to simply get rid of slavery one way or the other, however they have to do it. Slightly less radical, we have what we might call more moderate abolitionists. There were some, and probably a significant number of people in the population who would have loved to get rid of slavery. We're not willing to try to do it by any means necessary in the way that the radical abolitionists were willing to. They were not willing to go so far as John Brown and engage in active uprising against the government, but they still would have liked to see slavery abolished. On the other side, there were plenty of pro-slavery voters and individuals, mostly concentrated in the South, but more than a few in the North as well, who felt that the institution of slavery should be continued. And then there was the really radical faction among this group, almost exclusively Southerners, who were just blatantly secessionists. They wanted to see a separate Southern nation, so they didn't have to keep dealing with what they saw as this Northern nonsense. All these Northerners trying to push their economic values upon the South, trying to fundamentally seen as trying to alter the Southerners' way of life. For most of the secessionists, this really was about way of life, and it was a way of life very much and very explicitly supported by slavery. Now, stuck in the middle of all this, there were some people who didn't really have strong feelings necessarily on abolition, but in general, the folks in the middle, the political center, were unionists. What they were most concerned about was the idea of secession. You had, on the one hand, these Southern secessionists saying, well, we may as well leave and form our own nation. On the other hand, you have these radical abolitionists saying, well, you know what? That's probably okay. You go ahead. We'll abolish slavery in what's left of the United States. The unionists in the middle didn't really want to see that kind of a breakup. They wanted to hold together the union however they needed to. And they were willing to overlook Abraham Lincoln's famous idea that we cannot continue to exist half slave and half free. The unionists were convinced that we probably could. We had thus far, and perhaps we could keep that going. So all this was relatively ready to blow up by the time we get to the election of 1860. Keep in mind, another thing that happened during the 1850s was the rise of a new political party. The old division between Democrats and Whigs had been largely destroyed over the issue of slavery. The Whigs had kind of withered and died and been replaced by the Republican Party, which was an openly abolitionist party, perhaps not a radical abolitionist party. There were plenty of moderates among the Republicans, but the Republican Party had arisen largely on this issue of abolishing slavery. The Republicans ran their first presidential candidate in 1856, John C. Fremont, who lost but made a respectable showing against the Democrat James Buchanan. And so in 1860, the Republicans were eyeing the presidency, thinking that maybe they could actually put together a coalition to win this thing. The events early on in 1860 in the Democratic Party just bolstered those hopes. The Democrats, for their part, initially met in convention in April in Charleston, South Carolina, which was perhaps the most pro slavery location you could find in the United States at that time. Which is to say that there was an awful lot of pressure from bystanders, from the city itself in general, for the Democratic Party to produce a relatively pro-slavery platform and candidate. The only problem with this plan, of course, is that the leading candidate for the Democratic Party was Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, who was very much a moderate on slavery, very much a unionist, someone who was concerned about trying to keep everything together, rather than push for either abolition or present really a positive defense of slavery. Douglas was not especially liked through much of the South. He wasn't exactly disliked by most people at the time, but a lot of Southern slaveholders saw him as soft on this issue, and they felt that if they continued to nominate people who acted like Douglas did, or if they nominated Douglas and others like him, then they would simply end up with Congress slowly but surely choking out slavery and destroying what they saw as the Southern way of life. So there were a number of Southerners, led by William Yancey of Alabama, who was one of the South's most prominent defenders of slavery. Um, they were determined to beat Douglas. They were determined to not give Douglas the nomination. And one of the ways they were going to do this was by trying to get the convention to adopt an explicitly pro slavery platform. So these Southern delegates, who came to be known as fire eaters for their relatively hostile rhetoric, um, they managed to secure control of the platform committee. And the platform committee was going to suggest a platform before the candidate was selected. And so what they managed to do with these Southern votes in the platform committee is to get the committee to recommend an explicitly pro-slavery platform, one that virtually all the Northern delegates of the convention were convinced would be a sure loser in the Northern states. There was no way that the Democrats were going to win a national election on a strong, explicitly, unabashedly pro-slavery platform. So even though the Southerners and the fire eaters held a majority in the platform committee and managed to get this radical platform pushed through, the convention instead adopted a platform that was written by the minority on the committee, by most of those Northern delegates, which excluded the most radical pro-slavery proposals. The idea here was to soften the Democratic position on slavery in such a way as to hopefully still win some votes in Northern states. The moment the convention adopted this minority platform over the one that was adopted by, or that was proposed by the majority of the platform committee, um, many of the Southern delegates, in fact, most of the Southern delegates, walked out of the convention. This included the entire delegations from Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas, 7 states, and a handful of delegates from Arkansas and Delaware as well. These delegates promptly walked across the street, found another venue, and decided to form a separate convention, essentially. Meanwhile, while they were doing this, the main convention proceeded to start voting on nominees. But they had a problem, and the problem was a procedural issue. The Democratic Party at this time had a rule that the nominee for the party must secure two-thirds of the votes in the convention. Um, in the past, this had occasionally been a problem, but not a major problem. But it did mean that you needed a broad consensus within the party. Well, with a substantial chunk of delegates having walked out of the convention, this raised the question of whether that was actually 2/3 of the votes or 2/3 of the delegates. The convention chairman ruled that it was 2/3 of all the delegates, thus creating a much higher bar for securing the nomination. So once the convention began to vote, Stephen Douglas won a convincing majority on the first vote, but nowhere near the 2/3 necessary. He did exactly the same thing on the next 56 ballots. They went through 57 rounds of voting. Every single one showed Douglas with a commanding lead. Every single one saw Douglas fall short not only of the high bar of 2/3 of all delegates, but in fact fall short of 2/3 of those voting as well. And so it was very clear they were not going to be able to nominate Douglas or anyone else under these circumstances. And so the convention voted to adjourn and decided they would reconvene in June in Baltimore. It was not clear what that reconvening would look like, but they decided they would put off this decision and try to tackle it then. Meanwhile, in May, the Republicans were scheduled to meet in Chicago. The Republicans, of course, were gleeful at the results of the Democratic convention. They saw that substantial divide among Democrats as a sign that they could very well win this election. That if the Democrats did, in fact, divide, especially if they nominated multiple candidates, then the convention was there for the Republicans to take. The Republicans, like the Democrats, had an initial frontrunner, but a frontrunner who was much less secure in that status. This is Senator William Seward from New York. William Seward was a former governor of New York as well and had served in the Senate. And he was really the most prominent voice in Republican politics at the time. But there were a couple of legitimate challengers to him, including Salmon Chase, the governor of Ohio, and a former representative from Missouri by the name of Edward Bates. Now, these three candidates had all managed to alienate significant factions of the Republican Party. This is why there were three leading candidates instead of simply one frontrunner. Chase, as a former Democrat, was viewed with suspicion by many Whigs in the party, many former Whigs in the party. Bates was seen as too moderate for most of the radical Republicans, but he did have the support of the abolitionist publisher, Horace Greeley, the abolitionist publisher of the New York Tribune. Greeley had previously supported Seward. He was a supporter of Senator Seward earlier on, but the two had parted ways, and Greeley was now determined to see him defeated. And Seward, for his part, was seen by most moderates as too radical. He may not have actually been as radical as he was perceived, but the perception was certainly there. And Greeley's opposition was a major hurdle because Greeley was a very important figure among the abolitionists in the party, of which there were many. This left a significant number of long shot candidates who might have been able to unite the party on later ballots. They were looking to try to take advantage of the fact that none of these three looked like they could necessarily get the support of enough of the party to win the nomination. These candidates included several senators and former senators. They included John Fremont, the 1856 nominee, himself a former senator. Even included John McLean, who at the time was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. And then, of course, there was a man from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln. I trust you've heard of him before. Lincoln was not a candidate initially publicly, though he had privately been working towards a run at the presidency, and he had started to develop a national reputation. First from his time in the House of Representatives, then from his widely published debates with Stephen Douglas in the 1858 Senate election in Illinois. Douglas, of course, won, but won more narrowly than expected, and Lincoln was widely seen as having acquitted himself very well in the debates and in the election as well. And then Lincoln had started to gain additional notoriety from his Cooper Union speech earlier in 1860. He had for some time been laying the groundwork for a presidential run. For starters, he was instrumental in arranging to have the Republican convention held in Chicago to give him a home state advantage. The reason the Lincoln-Douglas debates were so widely published was because Lincoln had pushed for widespread publication. He'd managed to get them distributed. He'd arranged for a biography to be published so people knew who he was, knew where he was coming from. He'd recruited a significant number of surrogates to campaign for him at the convention. and more importantly, had secured the support of the Illinois delegation to the convention. So initially, he wasn't talked about much as a candidate, but he had quietly sort of put himself in position to do this. Because at the time, the convention handled nominations. There were no primaries, there were no popularity contests leading in. It just came down to the balloting at the convention. It usually took several ballots, and Lincoln saw that his best chance of winning was to become everybody's second choice. And this whole strategy worked much better than expected. For starters, the Illinois delegation not only supported him, they did so enthusiastically, and rounded up other support in the convention floor as well, to the point where in the initial ballot, Lincoln was actually a surprising second place behind only Seward, who was himself very far from a majority. He was nowhere near where he needed to secure the nomination. And so Lincoln, working to become the second choice of everybody there, had managed to secure a lot of the supporters of the other candidates to swing behind him instead of supporting the frontrunner Seward. So by the third ballot, Lincoln had consolidated most of the delegates who had voted for someone other than Seward in the first ballot, and Lincoln won the nomination fairly convincingly. The convention then turned to nominate Hannibal Hamlin, a senator from Maine, as his running mate, apparently much to the surprise of Hamlin, who proclaimed himself astonished with an appointment that he, quote, neither expected nor desired. But nonetheless, he agreed to run, um, which is kind of an important thing, because if he had declined the nomination, that changes things a little bit. At any rate, that was going to happen to the Democrats, but I'll get to that in a moment. When the Democrats met again in Baltimore, the first thing the delegates had to decide was whether to readmit those delegates who'd walked out, or to seat newly elected pro-Douglas delegates from the southern states. Douglas had been busy in between the conventions, making sure that he was prepared to get those votes that he needed. The convention ultimately decided to readmit all the delegates except those from Louisiana and Alabama. These were to be replaced by delegates who were largely sympathetic to Douglas's nomination. The moment the convention decided this, the Southern delegates again walked out to form their own convention. More delegates this time left than previously. The Democratic convention collectively shrugged their shoulders and proceeded to try to nominate a candidate. Douglas once again won the first ballot overwhelmingly, without the 2/3 necessary. He gained additional votes in the second ballot. But after the second ballot, someone in the convention realized that the total number of delegates there was now less than the 2/3 of all the delegates majority that was necessary to secure the nomination. And so it was mathematically impossible, not just for Douglas, but for anybody, even a unanimous choice, to win that 2/3. And so the convention voted unanimously to rescind that rule, and then declared by acclamation that Douglas would be their candidate. So Douglas, after all, after having won every single one of 59 ballots, ultimately became the candidate as everyone had expected from the beginning. The convention's choice for vice president, Senator Benjamin Fitzpatrick of Alabama, refused to serve. I'd mentioned before that at least the Republicans convinced Hamlin to go ahead and accept the job that he didn't particularly want. They could not do the same with Fitzpatrick. So Douglas offered the spot to Herschel Johnson, who was a former Georgia governor. There was never a question that the number 2 on that ticket had to be a Southerner. Douglas had angered enough Southern voters that if he'd chosen another Northerner on the ticket, this would have been a major blow to his chances of winning the election. Furthermore, very, very few presidents throughout American history to that point, very few tickets had won without having at least one Southerner on the ticket. A Southerner was seen as necessary because the South didn't quite dominate American politics, but certainly represented something to be considered, something to be appeased. So Douglas and Johnson came out as the Democratic nominees. But meanwhile, the Southern delegates who'd walked out held their own convention. Their convention wrapped up relatively quickly. They nominated John Breckinridge for president in the first ballot, and Joseph Lane as their vice president. So what ends up coming out of these two Democratic conventions is a mess. We have the Democratic candidate, we have a Southern Democratic candidate, neither of whom seems likely to do particularly well in the opposite region. Um, and what made this even worse was there was at least one more major presidential candidate to be decided. The Constitutional Union Party had been formed early in 1860, and it offered a home to former Whigs who would not join the Republicans and various other disaffected voters. They held a convention in May in Baltimore, and their convention, compared to the others, was fairly calm and peaceful. They nominated former Tennessee Senator John Bell on their second ballot. It only took 2 ballots for them. And he narrowly beat out Governor Sam Houston of Texas. Houston, incidentally, was later nominated by a group calling itself the People's Party, which was basically a loose group that existed just to nominate Houston. But Sam Houston, probably to his credit, recognized that at best he would be a sort of spoiler candidate. At worst, he would just do nothing in the election. And so he actually withdrew well before the election actually took place. The Constitutional Union Party nominated a former Secretary of State, Edward Everett, to be Bell's running mate. And basically, the appeal of this party was to those who were fundamentally unionists, those who saw Breckinridge as unacceptable, who saw Lincoln as a likely path to breaking the Union, to Southern secession. Bell was supposed to be an alternative to these potentially disastrous candidates, or at least this is the way that a lot of the political center saw this election. So we had 4 significant candidates going into the general election: Lincoln of the Republicans, Stephen Douglas of the Northern Democrats, Breckinridge of the Southern Democrats, and Bell for the Constitutional Union Party. Of these 4 candidates, only Stephen Douglas campaigned extensively, which was actually unusual up to that point. Candidates who campaigned, it was seen as sort of improper, as inappropriate to seek the presidency. Instead, most candidates up through this election would simply let surrogates do their work for them. They might give public speeches and such, they might release campaign literature, but they would not actively campaign. Douglas, though, worried not only about his own chances, but worried quite literally about the future of the Union, campaigned aggressively and energetically and tried to win over Southerners to his cause. He tried to win over Northern abolitionists. He tried to win over those who favored Union above all else. Douglas attempted to portray himself as potentially a candidate for everybody in a way that the other candidates were not. The others were all relatively factional in terms of their approach. Most of the other candidates, meanwhile, their campaigns engaged in various tactics to try to prevent one candidate or another from winning. There were several efforts to make fusion tickets in different states, some more successful than others. The way the fusion tickets would work again ties into the way that presidential elections were done at the time. Voters voting in presidential elections would not cast a ballot for a presidential candidate. They had to cast ballots for electors. They were electing electors who would then elect the president. Well, in order to elect these electors, they had to know who the electors were, and that was not always common knowledge. And so each candidate's campaign, or each party, would arrange to print out ballots with lists of the names of the electors and distribute those to voters, because there were no official ballots at the time. In fact, there were no secret ballots at the time anywhere in the United States. And so in order to cast a vote, you had to cast a piece of paper with the names of those people you were voting for. You had to have essentially the right number of candidates. If you're voting for multiple electors, if you had too few names, that was okay. If you had too many, then the ballot was invalid. And so candidates and campaigns would put together these lists of electors. The fusion tickets were in certain states, say the Breckinridge and Bell campaigns or the Breckinridge and Douglas campaign, would work together to come up with a mixed list of electors, where a voter would cast one of these pre-made ballots, and it might contain, say, 4 Douglas electors and 3 Breckinridge electors. And the idea here was to try to appeal to those who didn't particularly strongly like one candidate, or maybe disliked all of them. Typically, the fusion candidates or the fusion tickets were designed to try to defeat a particular candidate more so than to get somebody elected. Because if a fusion ticket of, say, Breckinridge and Bell were to win the state, what that means is the state effectively gets split. Neither wins the whole thing. But if in the process it prevents Lincoln from winning a northern state, both Breckinridge and Bell potentially benefit from that. So there was a lot of effort to do this. Again, some of it was somewhat successful. A lot of it was not. But there's also the efforts to try to get people to the polls, to get them the ballots they needed, to make sure they were voting the right way. Again, as I said, there were no secret ballots, so it was much easier at that point to not only persuade somebody to vote a certain way, but to make sure that they actually did. One other X factor in this election was that the president of the United States, James Buchanan, was quietly supporting Breckinridge, in large part because he did not like Stephen Douglas. Also didn't care for a Republican win in this either, but he was quietly supporting Breckinridge in the hopes of defeating Douglas. But most Democrats in the North were working against Lincoln. And so the president and his surrogates were sort of working at cross purposes with his own party. This undoubtedly hurt Douglas in the long run, probably more than hurt Lincoln. Had Buchanan pushed or gotten behind Douglas, it could have changed the outcome somewhat. It's not likely Douglas would have won, but if he'd won a couple more states, he might have prevented Lincoln from having an outright majority. But I will come back to that. Um, in the end, though, now let me put up a map here. In the end, though, what we have is this is the electoral map, the electoral outcome. What we have in the end is a very, very regional election. In particular, Breckinridge won Maryland, Delaware, and every state south of Tennessee. As you can see, those red states there. Bell won the border states of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. Douglas won only Missouri and some of the New Jersey delegates, in part because of a failed fusion ticket experiment there that sent some of the votes to Lincoln and others to Douglas. And then Lincoln won pretty much everything else. He won all the northern states. He won the western states. And of course, the bulk of the population was in the big states in the north: New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio. These are the three largest states in the Union at the time, and Lincoln won all three. Lincoln ended up with a fairly comfortable Electoral College margin of 180 votes out of 303, but had he lost New York somehow, which New York was not especially close, but had he lost New York, he would have been short of a majority, and the election would have gone to the House of Representatives. Had he lost Pennsylvania, he would have had one electoral vote to spare over that minimum majority. So this was a relatively close matter, some of these northern states. Had Douglas been able to pick up a couple more states, then, or even just pick up New York somehow, that would have been enough to sway the election. Now, what would have happened if it had gone to the House of Representatives? Who knows? This is a really, really difficult thing to work out, because remember, when the House votes by state. And so if each state voted exactly the way that if each state voted exactly the way they'd voted in the Electoral College, nobody would have had an outright majority. And so this would have been interesting to see, but it probably would have been very, very contentious, possibly even disastrous. But the regional notes on the regional nature of this map, it's important to remember the differences in voting, as I already mentioned. There were no secret ballots. Since there were no secret ballots, a voter in the South who wanted to vote for Lincoln was likely to face at least public shaming and ostracism, if not worse. A voter in the North wanting to vote for Breckinridge, in some areas, this was actually equally dangerous. Not everywhere. There were pockets of Breckinridge support up in the North. But in general, supporting an unpopular candidate was a tricky thing. And in fact, in the South, this went even worse. In a lot of these states, it was effectively impossible to vote for Abraham Lincoln, because in order to vote for Lincoln, one would have needed to vote for pledged Lincoln electors. And in most of the southern states, there was no one willing to pledge their vote to Lincoln. So what that means is there are a number of states here where Lincoln receives no votes because even if a voter wanted Lincoln as president, they, outside of social pressure to vote otherwise, they didn't even have the mechanism to vote for him. They could have written in Abraham Lincoln, but that would have been an invalid vote because he was not a resident of those states and could not have been an elector. And since nobody was willing to publicly step forward as a Lincoln elector in those states, he actually received 0 votes in most of these southern states. Ballot access was, of course, not a thing at the time. It was not a matter of being on the ballot. Anyone could theoretically have cast a vote for any set of electors for the state. But in the absence of a published list of pledged electors, it was almost impossible to vote for a particular candidate. So the bottom line is it's hard to say exactly how votes might have looked differently if we'd had secret ballots, if everybody had been on the ballot. Undoubtedly, Lincoln would have won some votes in the South. It stretches credulity to say that there was not a single person in the Deep South who would have liked to see Lincoln win. It's just that in the absence of a secret ballot, they just didn't think it was worth it to cast that vote. And in the absence of a slate of electors, they didn't really have any way to cast the vote anyway. So this regional cast to it is a little bit skewed by the way things were done. Nonetheless, it did end up giving Lincoln a convincing electoral college win. That's an important thing, because this was an election where the electoral college was critically important. And the reason for this is because if we look at the vote totals, Lincoln won 59% of the electoral votes, but only just under 40% of the popular vote. Douglas, on the other hand, won almost 30% of the popular vote, but only 12 electoral votes. The reason for this is that Douglas finished second almost everywhere in the North and had more than a few votes in a lot of places in the South. And in the absence of the Electoral College, if we have a straight up plurality vote, we end up with a president winning with 39% of the vote, almost 40% of the vote. But because of the Electoral College, it becomes a much more convincing win. If we go back to the map for a moment, it's very clear that Lincoln had widespread support across the North and the West, and clearly had the electors there to win a legitimate election here. The Electoral College makes Lincoln's win more convincing, more legitimate, and enables him really to consolidate support. Now, granted, in the aftermath of the election, the southern states secede. Even in the absence of the Electoral College, they would have done that, and Lincoln did win an outright majority of votes in the North. So his legitimacy in the North would not have been questioned anyway. But the southern questions of his legitimacy had everything to do with him and nothing to do with the way in which he was elected. So I don't need to say a whole lot about the aftermath of the 1860 election. Certainly the secession of the southern states is pretty well known, as is President Buchanan's refusal to do much of anything in response. But I did start this talk off by talking about this being a much more conventional election than is typically supposed. What I mean by that is that the distribution or the establishment of candidates outside of a split in a convention was fairly normal. We had candidates with clear-cut different positions. A vote for Lincoln was a vote for the Republican Party, not necessarily a vote for abolition. Lincoln insisted he wouldn't be able to abolish slavery as president, but certainly a vote against slavery. A vote for Breckinridge was clearly a pro-slavery vote. It was a vote to continue at least the status quo in slavery, and to essentially express support for such a position. A vote for Douglas was somewhere in between there. It was a vote that was not entirely comfortable with endorsement of slavery, but at the same time, it was definitely very much a vote for union, a vote against efforts to try to force abolition on the South. And a vote for Bell was largely a vote that represented dissatisfaction with the major parties, a vote that said maybe slavery isn't where we should be focused. Maybe what we need to do is set that aside, keep it as it is, and focus on coming together as a union. And so we had 4 distinct positions here, 4 candidates representing those distinct positions. Aside from that, I mean, the distribution of ballots was regionally a little strange, but functioned largely as it should. And of course, the electoral vote ultimately legitimizes the election in exactly the way that it's supposed to. It ensures that whoever is elected has won a majority of the electors, demonstrating relatively broad geographic support and widespread support in the population. And so all this functioned relatively well. There was no question of the electoral results. There was no question that Lincoln won. Um, it was just a question of what the South was going to do in response. And of course, they made their decision to secede, which incidentally, the fire eaters and other radical pro-slavery forces may well have been pushing for that in the first place. When they split the votes in the Democratic convention, they may have known full well that that was going to hand Lincoln the presidency or hand the Republicans the presidency. But remember, a lot of those more radical pro slavery Democrats wanted to see secession in the first place. And so it's quite possible that a significant number of them saw this as the outcome they wanted. They wanted to see Lincoln elected so that they could get that excuse for a clean break. One way or the other, of course, after the election of 1860 and the secession of the Southern states, the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, and all that follows, the United States as a nation is never quite the same. 1860 is arguably perhaps the most pivotal election in American history. It's not because the election didn't work as planned, it's merely because the issue of slavery simply could not be put off any longer. It had simply become untenable um, to continue existing half free and half slave. And so the election of 1860 ultimately causes this major break, causes a major change in terms of how the Union operates, and really separates early American history from later American history. So, so ultimately, its importance is not that there was anything wrong with how it worked. It worked roughly as the system was supposed to work. Its importance ultimately came down to what it was about, who was involved, and how it turned out.